The energy is hectic. The current energy is definitely hectic. But we shall persevere through the hecticness with an equally hectic story from the far land of Bhutan. I learned a new English phrase today. It is called, hi guys, welcome to my live. Hello, hello, hello. How are we gonna do this? Okay, Bhutanese history. Bhutanese history. I learned a new English phrase today called counting someone's pocket. It means that if you're keeping account of someone else's success or wealth, it means you're coming for their pocket because you're not doing that well yourself. So that's what some people do. And yeah, like I think in India, it's pretty common. We don't even have a term for it anymore because what else would we be doing with such high youth unemployment? We could be reading the history of Bhutan and learning about the Tibetan Mistress. Her name is Yanki. It's a pretty common Himalayan name. I did not hear of this name before or the story of her being the mistress. It is also in this history of Bhutan, which you can tell is quite liberal in that sense. Oh, and happy birthday to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Happy birthday, 90th birthday. Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This story is not that happy in a way. It's very much tea. So if you like tea about the Himalayan region, stick with me. What's your favorite color? Pick one. Pick one from this mask. Someone says hi. Blue. Someone says blue. Yellow. Okay, blue and yellow are my favorite colors. Security, sovereignty, and the dragon's wrath. Bhutan's emergence from a medieval polity and her entry onto the global stage as a modern nation state in the second half of the 20th century took place in the midst of a very precarious chapter of regional politics. When the third king ascended the throne in 1953, India had barely recovered from the ravages of partition. William says blue. And its territorial boundaries were far from secure. In the following decades, India fought several wars with Pakistan to the west and lost a major war against China in 1962 along Bhutan's borders in the northeastern frontiers. Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan, broke away and emerged as a new state in 1971, while Sikkim, Bhutan's neighboring Buddhist kingdom, got usurped. To the north, Bhutan's intercourse with Tibet was eclipsed by China's expansionist policy to liberate and annex Tibet to its motherland. As the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, Tibetan political refugees, like in ancient times, trickled into Bhutan throughout the 1950s. When the brutal occupation of Tibet by China reached its climax in 1959, the Tibetan leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, fled to India. Bhutan saw an exodus of Tibetans into Bhutan. This led to the closure of Bhutan's northern border and brought an abrupt end to the historical exchanges with Tibet, which in the meantime went through a tumultuous period under the communist occupation and the madness of the Cultural Revolution. Tibet's harrowing tribulation under a repressive China continues in our times, as indicated by the incessant self-immolations. In comparison, Bhutan enjoyed relative peace and security under the capable leadership of the kings. The southward diplomatic relationship Bhutan had developed with India no doubt played a significant part in ensuring Bhutan's sovereignty and peace. While the explicit confirmation of Bhutan's independence in the Treaty of 1959 helped Bhutan avoid too much Indian interference, the article in the treaty allowing India to guide Bhutan in its external affairs certainly deterred any expansionist interests the Chinese in Tibet could have harbored. Bhutan was certainly in the orbit of Indian influence as far as international politics was concerned. This was definitely made clear by Jawaharlal Nehru's visit to Bhutan in September 1958, when he traveled to Paro on horseback and on yaks. His historic visit was later followed by his daughter and grandson as prime ministers and a host of other Indian dignitaries. To make communications easier, the king also moved his court from Bumthang and Mangda first to Paro and then to Thimpu. The third king visited India many times, as did his son and grandson, and a very close relationship also developed between the royal family and the Gandhi family, which continues to this day. In addition to the close political rapport, independent India also became the main sponsor of Bhutan's development programs. Following Nehru's visit, independent India provided both financial and technical support needed for socio-economic development, which British India was reluctant to give despite requests. India's role in Bhutan's affairs at the time of political expansionism in the region was of great benefit to Bhutan, as was the generous support it gave for development in Bhutan. Yet it required shrewd diplomacy and political dexterity on the part of Bhutan's leaders to skillfully juggle with a chaotic power like India. India at times was only too keen to play a big brother role in the affairs of Bhutan, especially in foreign relations. Such political dominance was possible with its powerful presence. The main artery of motor roads in Bhutan was built and managed by an Indian paramilitary company. Bhutan's northern borders were guarded by Indian soldiers, and some of the main advisors to the king were Indian. The fear of Indian expansion into Bhutan was quite real. And we have some photos of Nehru with his daughter Indira, R.I.P. This is Indira Gandhi. This is Jawaharlal Nehru. The rest are Bhutanese royal family of the Druk Gyalpo. Indira Gandhi wearing modern clothes, first of its kind in my memory. Okay, we will skip now to the Mistress drama. The Mistress drama. The third king faced a spate of internal turmoil following the assassination of Jigme Dorji, the king's brother-in-law, who acted also as his prime minister in 1964. The king was already at that time suffering from poor health and was being flown in and out of the country for treatment of a serious heart problem. Rumors were rife about tension between the king and his court officials on the one hand, and the Dorji family of the queen and prime minister on the other. Rostamji, a royal family friend and advisor at this time, whose book is the most detailed account of this turmoil, saw this tension as one between the conservative traditionalist members of the royal court and the modernist and pro-Indian Dorji family. Easton Sadler says hi. Leo Rose rejects this and the king and his court. Leo Rose rejects this and gives the account of internal marital intrigue to explain the troubles. He blames the assassination on the family and supporters of the Tibetan Mistress of the king. Whatever the actual cause, the prime minister was shot by a sniper in the middle of a card game, and the king's chief of army was implicated in the assassination and executed in public after a quick trial. Even with the execution, the matter was far from settled, as some harbored suspicions that the king might have implicitly given the order to eliminate his prime minister, while others feared the in-laws might be plotting to overthrow the king. Word went around that a serious rift had developed between the Wangchuk and Dorji families, and if we were to believe Rustamji, who claimed to be close to both families, the royal marriage was at a very low point. In fact, some members of the Dorji family and their supporters even left Bhutan on self-imposed exile. To make things worse, there was also an attempt on the king's life in Paro in 1965. The king narrowly missed a grenade thrown at him, although this was again suspected by some to have been staged by the king to highlight the perceived threat. These tensions and rumors eventually passed, and the king managed to maintain a firm grip on the affairs of the country. The brief turmoil was a good reminder of the precariousness of the political situation, but was of no serious consequence to the rule of monarchy or Bhutan's political stability. The country as a whole was firmly behind the king, but the position of the Tibetan mistress, however, did not diminish, as she became a mother of royal children. Perhaps emboldened by this, she began to increasingly appear in public as a royal consort, and her audacious, ostentatious behavior got on the nerves of the royal in-laws. Sadly, the frail health of the king took a downturn before he could resolve the problems in his private life. The king died in 1972 in Nairobi from heart failure, bringing an abrupt end to his visionary and benevolent rule. The 17-year-old crown prince now took over the charge of the country without recourse to the interim regency, but not long after he came into power, a plot by the Tibetan mistress and her cohort to overthrow the king and blow up the Jashi Choson was said to have been uncovered just in the nick of time. The plot was successfully aborted, but the mistress managed to flee to India. Following this, many Tibetan refugees, including a couple important figures, were arrested and questioned, as were some Bhutanese officials who were close to the mistress. The incident led to a sordid acrimony between Bhutan and the Tibetan refugees, who the government felt abused the hospitality extended to them. As a result, thousands of Tibetan refugees who had previously settled in Bhutan moved to India, although a great many stayed in Bhutan and enjoyed the same privileges as Bhutanese citizens. While very little is recorded or available in the public domain about this unfortunate episode, His Holiness the Dalai Lama long held that his people in Bhutan have been made scapegoat of an internal Bhutanese conflict. On the contrary, the Bhutanese believe that even the Dalai Lama's older brother had a hand in a subterfuge to oust the king and replace him by one of the sons of the late king from the Tibetan mistress. Her name's Yanki. Ironically, the first ever Tibetan hunger protest in Delhi is said to have been staged against Buddhist Bhutan, not China. The acrimony with the Tibetans was almost forgotten towards the end of the 1980s, and the last prisoners held for their involvement in the alleged coup were being set free when a much more serious problem of dissidents began to brew in southern Bhutan among people of Nepali origin. We have already seen in the previous chapter how some of the British officers expressed misgivings concerning the rising population of Nepali immigrants in Bhutan. The British saw how the growing population of immigrants from a different culture was turning into a problem. Both the second king and the third king faced small acts of dissent by leading immigrants of Nepali origin who had some exposure to the democratic processes in the subcontinent. However, the dissidents to take place during the fourth king's reign at the end of the 1980s surpassed earlier protests in both scale and fervor. The Hermit Kingdom, according to the current prime minister, was forcibly shaken out of its cloister by this, and it led to a protracted international refugee issue which would scar Bhutan's peaceful face to the world for several decades. A great deal has already been written. Much of these writings are available, including my own analysis. This is Dr. Karma Punsuk. The sordid conflict was essentially an ethnic collision, although it was presented in extremes by the dissidents as a program of an ethnic cleansing. The issue is a very complex one involving problems of immigration. The immigrants of Nepali origin who had settled in Bhutan by 1958 were given full citizenship with generous cash incentives for cross-cultural marriages. The government also undertook an active program of integration for the immigrants to assimilate into the culture. Instead of referring to them as Nepali, the term Southerner was used as a politically correct one, Lo Champa, the South, who have legally settled. So if you're a Southerner in Bhutan, you are a legal person from Nepal. Aware of the cultural and political malaise among the immigrant populace, the government made special allowances, but primarily to encourage them to assimilate into the mainstream culture rather than boost their own ethnic identity. For the latter, the designation for those of Nepali origin who have legally settled in Bhutan. For the latter, the immigrants looked up to Nepal, their land of origin. The southern population, however, did not consist merely of citizens. There were thousands who entered Bhutan illegally through the porous border and settled there. This scenario arose due to the demographic mess the Himalayan foothills were in, with an enormous mass of roaming Nepalis looking for greener pastures. While Nepal was bursting with its fast-growing population, Bhutan had low population density, plenty of fertile land, and better social services, including free education and health care, which attracted a lot of immigrants. It was the separation of the legal and illegal immigrants during the census of 1988 without a reliable system to prove either way, which finally triggered a rebellion. The rebellion was no doubt partly occasioned by the enforcement of Bhutan's policies. The king came to realize that Bhutan's cultural identity in the absence of military might or economic power was its defining strength for sovereignty. Thus, Bhutanese culture was actively promoted through various programs, including the enforcement of Druk Gyalpo, a traditional code of etiquette, like wearing the national dress. It did not go well with the southern population who were used to Nepali dress, as well as the Bhutanese youth who preferred Western trousers. The wound got deeper when the government removed the Nepali language from the school curriculum in 1989. No doubt the southern population felt these cultural strictures acutely as the Nepali culture and language was expanding unabated into other parts of the Himalayan foothills. Even replacing other cultures, Sikkim was a good example. It first suffered a cultural invasion and lost its sovereignty due to this immigration. Bhutan direly needed to avoid Sikkim's fate. Therefore, the Southern Rebellion was not caused by merely domestic grievances. It was indirectly fueled by political changes in Nepal, where Nepal's king was stripped of his power by the new democratic uprising, and the rise of Nepali power in Sikkim and the hill stations in West Bengal. Moreover, some ideas of cultural expansionism across the foothills from Nepal to Burma and an associated nationalism to build a greater state was floating in the region. Such political dreams and the hope of getting support from the democratic Nepal undoubtedly contributed to the sudden outburst of demonstration against the southern districts of Bhutan. Anti-government protests were carried out in several places in 1990, but the rebels went overboard to burn the national flag, strip national dresses, and destroy census records. If the protests were intended to be civil disobedience, this was thwarted at the outside by its wayward advocates. Instead of seeing it as a human rights movement, the majority of the public viewed it as a campaign against the very existence of Bhutan. A fairly bloody conflict between the military and the armed rebels in India, supported by diaspora in India, unfolded along southern Bhutan as the government scoured the area of recalcitrant rebels. For Bhutan, this was a serious test as it had not experienced any political upheaval of such magnitude since its last war with the British in 1865, let alone an ethnic group known for its valor at war. The protracted conflict led to the suspension of all development programs in the southern areas. The government accused the rebels of arson, robbery, extortion, kidnapping, and murder, while the dissidents accused the government of genocide. Most of the innocent southern citizens of Nepali origin were trapped, being suspected of treason by both, against their country by the government and against their own people by the rebels. On a personal level, it was a conflict between a person's political affiliation and cultural identity. Caught between the devil and the deep sea, many of them immigrated in the hope of finding a safe home in Nepal, where the UNHRC and Red Cross opened a refugee camp, but most stayed in Bhutan to rebuild their lives. The conflicts subsided by the middle of 1990s in favor of the state, but they left behind a protracted refugee issue which remains unresolved. The UNHRC camps in eastern Nepal received about 6,000 refugees from Bhutan at the height of the conflict, but the number shot up in the following years, reaching over 100,000 by the end of 1993. While Nepal and some international organizations claimed all of them to be Bhutanese refugees, Bhutan contested that they were all Bhutanese citizens. With a generous daily allowance and poor process of verification, Bhutan argued that the landless people in the area joined the refugee bandwagon. In an attempt to resolve the crisis, the government of Nepal and Bhutan held some 15 rounds of bilateral talks. By 2003, the most significant achievement of the negotiations being the formation of the Joint Verification Team. This team undertook the verification of 12,000 residents of the Kundunabari camp and declared that 293 were forcibly evicted from Bhutan, 8,595 immigrated voluntarily, and 347 fled after criminal activities. The remainder, 2,900, that is almost a quarter of the total, were said to have no links to Bhutan. When the result was announced, the Bhutanese members of the verification team came under missile attack from the crowd. This incident sadly stalled the negotiations, and Nepal no further investigations because it was beset by its own political turmoil. Meanwhile, many Western countries have offered third country settlements for some of the refugees, with the U.S. alone agreeing to take about 60,000. By the end of 2011, over half of the refugees have left the camps to begin their new lives in third countries. In Bhutan itself, the refugee issue has ceased to be of any significance apart from its havoc it continues to cause to Bhutan's projection as a happy country. At the height of the conflict, Bhutan saw a spate of nationalism, which was partly fueled by the state slogans such as "One Nation, One People." Such fever and ethnic tensions fully subsided by the beginning of the new political chapter in 2008. The Lhotshampas, Southerners, who still make up about 25% of the population, have integrated into the mainstream. The rebellion from the south was barely over when Bhutan was challenged by another security threat, which we will skip. Socioeconomic and cultural transformations. In spite of the minor turbulences, Bhutan's political transformation from a medieval polity to a 21st century democracy was a steady process. It neither caused any serious disruption to the community or to the continuity of life in the country, nor led to any radical shift in the power paradigm. The successful leaders were very wise and far-sighted to bring about a healthy and progressive change, and the people were not totally unfamiliar of health, education, and living standards. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Bhutan went through a greater societal change in the last 50 years than it did in the 500 years before the modern era. The changes catapulted the country from a medieval polity to a modern world of secular scientific worldview. The year 1959 marks the beginning of Bhutan's modernization. Following the visit of Jawaharlal Nehru, Bhutan launched its large-scale development programs through Indian support. The brutal occupation of Tibet by China reached its culmination in March 1959 after a failed uprising by the Tibetans and the departure of His Holiness the Dalai Lama into exile. The first major development project was the construction of motor roads. The construction of roads began in earnest in 1959, although the plan for the East-West National Highway was drawn only in 1961. This framework for development was based on the Soviet model, which Bhutan emulated. The first 5-year plan started in 1961, and the current 10th 5-year plan is due to end in 2013. This book was written, I guess, around that time. By the end of the first 5-year plan in 1966, Bhutan had an impressive 1,770 kilometers of motorable roads, and it has reached to 9,400 in 2011. The introduction of Druk Air Service in 1983 took the development of communication even further. Today, the domestic air service connects places in eastern and western Bhutan. Eastern and western Bhutan in 20 minutes, covering a distance which earlier took about 20 days or 20 hours by car. 20 days by foot, 20 hours by car. And Bhutan can also reach countries beyond India with international flights. Bhutanese today can be found in Australia and Alaska, and they have ventured to pilgrimage as well in India. The Bhutanese conception and understanding of world, time, and space has been utterly transformed. With it, people's interests, outlooks, and lifestyles. The development in communication was not merely of physical movement, but also of ideas and information. Postal service was introduced, and then telegraph, and now there's internet. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you guys can visit remote village festivals as tourists to Bhutan.